Now, on another topic, I'd like to give a quarterly assessment of the Senate, and that's what my colleagues will talk about as well. Well, we have over a year and a half left in the Congress, but Leader McConnell has already turned this chamber into a legislative graveyard. And without a shred of irony, he has fashioned himself the Senator's Grim Reaper and seems to be proud of the title. That is not what the American people want. The number one comment we all get when we go back to our states, wherever they be, why can't you all work together? But McConnell is refusing to do that. Look what we're doing this week on the floor of the Senate. Just appointments. That's all they can talk about when they come here. No real legislation to improve the lives of average folks. Here are some of the things that passed the House. Legislation to oppose the Trump administration lawsuit against protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. Doesn't move in the Senate. Common sense background checks for gun purchases, which 90% of Americans support. No movement in the Senate. Much needed reforms to improve elections, restore voting rights, get money out of politics. Doesn't move in the Senate. All of these things are very popular with the American people, Democrats, independents, and Republicans. They're not partisan bills. They're common sense proposals to solve some of our country's basic problems. The Senate should be tackling these issues. McConnell can put bills, if he doesn't want to put the House bill on the floor, put something that deals with the subject and let us amend it. But he refuses to do any of it. So what has he been doing instead? Expediting the approval of alarmingly unqualified and radical nominees to the executive and the judiciary. Over the next 2 years, the Republican Senate is in danger of becoming little more than a staffing agency for the administration's radical nominees. And that's not going to sit well with the American people. It's not going to help Republican incumbents who are running. It's a tragedy. Last fall, the American people sent a clear message demanding a change on how we do business in Washington. The American people voted for action. They want action now on some pretty basic everyday matters, protecting and expanding affordable quality health care, including lowering prescription drug costs, taking bold action on climate change and gun safety, and defending the fundamental right to vote. Poll after poll shows this is what America wants the Senate to do. But Leader McConnell, the Grim Reaper, has turned the Senate into a legislative graveyard. That's not good politics for him and his majority, but it's worse, bad substance, bad governance for the American people. We cannot afford to have Leader McConnell turn one chamber of their government into a legislative graveyard for 2 full years. And we're doing an opposite order today. I don't know why it's this way. We usually do now in seniority order. Merkley. Sorry, Tina.
Thank you. Well, Mitch McConnell has become the Grim Reaper of the Senate, turning the Senate into a legislative graveyard. And it's a graveyard for common sense reforms. And what reform is more important than the defense of our Constitution? The House has acted on H.R. 1, but the For the People bill here in the Senate shows no signs of even getting a hearing in a legislative committee. We do have a We the People Constitution, but it's being corrupted by gerrymandering and voter suppression and intimidation and dark money, each of these violating core principles of our Constitution. Gerrymandering, destroying fair representation in the House of Representatives. Voter suppression, intimidation, taking down the foundation, the ability of citizens to vote. And dark money, destroying the Jeffersonian principle of distributed power that he called equal voice, that he said was the mother principle, that he said was essential to have laws that reflect the will of the people. Well, we have no higher responsibility than to defend our Constitution. We come to this chamber and we start by taking an oath to the Constitution. So these reforms, so essential to sustaining the We the People vision of our Constitution, must not be buried in Mitch McConnell's graveyard.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Leader Schumer. I don't meet anybody in Connecticut who thinks that the Senate should do nothing. There's no one that I meet that thinks that there are no improvements we can make to the healthcare system, that there's nothing that we could do to make our kids safer when they go to school, that the economy needs absolutely no adjustment. There's no one I meet that thinks that we should do nothing, and yet that is what the Senate is doing today. 3 times a week, the Senate Republicans meet for lunch behind us. And occasionally they walk into that chamber and take a vote or 2 or 3 each week on judges. That is the sum total of the Senate's work today. Mitch McConnell has effectively turned the United States Senate into a very expensive lunch club that occasionally votes on a judge or 2. That is not what the American people want us to do. Kids today do not feel safe in their schools. Parents today are so fearful of the next mass shooting. Our city streets are less safe today than they have been in years. And there is a bipartisan bill that the House passed, H.R. 8, which reflects the will of 95% of Americans to require that everybody have to prove that they're not a criminal before they buy a gun. We cannot get a vote in the Senate on that bill. We cannot get a debate in the Senate on that bill. We can't even get a public hearing on that bill in the United States Senate, despite the fact that it is in front of us from the House of Representatives and supported by 90% of Americans. Apple pie and grandma aren't 90% supported by the American public. Background checks are. It's time for the Senate to stop being a legislative graveyard and start doing the work of the American people. The background checks bill would be a good place to start.
Senator Smith.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I know that Minnesotans sent me here to Washington, D.C. to get things done for them and not just to have lunch. I also know that my colleagues here want to get work done, and we stand ready to do that. But yet, over and over and over again, we find ourselves doing nothing but voting on judges and other administration appointees when there is important work that our people back at home expect us to do. And here's a classic example of that. We know that Americans want to keep health care protection so that nobody is denied health insurance coverage because they have a pre-existing condition like cancer or diabetes or pregnancy. And yet, we cannot have a vote on that. Think about what's going on here. This administration right now is supporting a lawsuit that would invalidate these protections for pre-existing conditions. They are actively working against those pre-existing conditions. Our colleagues over in the House passed a resolution saying, can't we all just at least agree that we think that no American should not be denied health insurance coverage because they have a pre-existing condition? Yet, we cannot get even a vote on something as simple and as basic as that here in the United States Senate. I urge our Republican colleagues to come together and say, let's at least vote on a resolution saying that we support making insurance companies cover Americans because they have a pre-existing condition.